Welcome to the deep dive.
Today, we are immersing ourselves in one of the most fraught and dramatic periods of modern history,
Yeah,
the 19th century struggle of the Ottoman Empire.
that's right. This deep dive is tailor-made for you, the learner, who knows that the Ottoman Empire wasn't some, static relic.
Not in
It was this vast, ancient entity that spent a full century trying to reinvent itself. We're talking about frantic, often violent modernization.
It's an incredible story. You have an empire that once spanned 3 continents suddenly realizing its structural integrity is failing, and it is in a desperate race against time.
So our mission today is to really extract the most vital insights from the sources covering the Ottoman state from, the accession of Selim III in 1789?
Exactly, right up to the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. And this whole period, this 120-year span, it's defined by an almost impossible tension.
Tradition wrestling against necessity.
Violently wrestling against existential necessities, a constant struggle.
And the outcome of that struggle, the relentless internal conflict against reform and these catastrophic external defeats, that's what ultimately gave difficult and often bloody birth to the modern Turkish state.
What's truly remarkable, and what you see again and again in the sources, is the core paradox. They were trying to change absolutely everything.
The military, the tax system, the law.
The entire finance structure,
Yeah.
all of it. But, and this is the key, they were simultaneously insisting that the supreme authority at the top, the centuries-old institution of the Sultan and the Caliphate, must remain absolutely inviolable, unchanged.
And that tension, that's what created the chaos we're going to see throughout the century.
It is the central conflict.
So to help us and you navigate this, let's use a core organizing principle, an analogy we can come back to.
Good idea.
Imagine the Ottoman Empire as a massive ancient cathedral. It's a masterpiece of history, but by the late 1700s, it's structurally unsound. The timber is rotten, masonry is crumbling, the whole thing is in trouble.
And the reformers, these are our architects of the 19th century. The Selims, the Mahmuds, the Tanzimat statesmen, they knew they had to replace the aging structure with modern materials.
Right. They needed Western steel and glass, new institutions, new legal codes.
But the fundamental rule of the renovation was this. You have to do the work while the building is still in use. You can't just shut it down and start over.
And here's the part that, really doomed so much of their effort. The single heaviest part of the entire cathedral, that ancient, massive spire representing the absolute Sultanate and Caliphate, was left right on top.
Exactly. So every time the reformers tried to pour a new, modern foundation, let's say universal legal equality or a representative government, the sheer crushing weight of that heavy spire just caused the new, fragile foundations to crack.
Immediately.
Instantly. And to top it all off, the entire century-long renovation was so impossibly expensive, especially after all the military losses, that the owners had no choice but to mortgage the entire property
To the neighbor.
to the neighbors, specifically the great European powers. So this image of internal structural strain, coupled with this overwhelming foreign financial dependency, that's really going to illuminate everything we discussed today.
Okay, let's unpack that first stage, the diagnosis. We all know the phrase sick man of Europe, but when did the empire truly realize it was, structurally unsound? What were the symptoms of that crisis?
The symptoms were terminal military failures. Ottoman power had decisively peaked way back in 1683 with the failed siege of Vienna.
And that loss led directly to the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699.
Which was devastating. It forced them to cede major possessions in Central Europe, particularly to Austria. And crucially, that treaty marked the first time the Ottomans negotiated peace after a defeat, not on their own terms. It basically arrested their westward expansion for good.
So the 18th century wasn't just stagnation, it was this constant grinding and often catastrophic series of losses, especially against Russia.
Especially against Russia, its primary arch-rival. By the late 18th century, any military confrontation with Russia was just consistently disastrous. The war renewed in 1787. It was a catastrophe.
And the problem wasn't just troop numbers, was it? It was a systemic failure.
It was systemic, a failure to compete with contemporary European military technology, their logistics, their training.
But what's so interesting is that in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Ottoman military, with its cannons and early muskets, was one of the most advanced fighting forces on the planet.
That's the bitter irony, isn't it? They had pioneered military innovation, but by the 1780s, that advantage had completely flipped. European armies had shifted to professional, standing national corps.
Funded by modern centralized treasury.
Right. The Ottoman army, by contrast, was this complex mix of Janissaries, provincial militias, traditional feudal levies. The sources are clear that after fighting dragged on until 1791 and 1792, the Ottoman forces were utterly exhausted. They just could not sustain modern warfare.
And the Treaty of Jassy in 1792, that forced the Sultan to concede territory along the northern shores of the Black Sea.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Which exposed the empire's soft underbelly. So when Selim III comes to the throne in 1789, he walks into a state that is technically bankrupt and militarily obsolete. He knew he couldn't just tinker.
He needed a wholesale transformation.
A complete transformation.
And that was the Nizam-Cedid, the new order. What was the central idea behind his reform? Was it only about the military?
It was primarily military, but the goal was systemic. The Nizam-ı was the first major systematic effort to adopt Western models for the army and the administration you needed to fund and manage it.
So new European-trained infantry regiments, new ministries.
Exactly. New ministries for foreign affairs, for finance, to handle the growing complexity.
And it's interesting that this intense domestic reform is happening at the same time as the Napoleonic era, this global upheaval from 1799 to 1815. Did that help the Ottomans at all?
It gave them a complicated geopolitical window. The great powers were, distracted by Napoleon, which briefly deterred Russia from pressing its advantage. That was a huge reprieve.
But Napoleon himself invaded Egypt in 1798.
Exactly. So while they benefited from European distractions elsewhere, they were still fighting a major European power on their own soil. It was never simple.
Okay, let's get to the core of the problem. The resistance. Selim's efforts weren't just met with reluctance. It was a violent, bloody backlash that actually cost him his life.
Right.
So why was the traditional establishment, our heavy ancient spire, so violently resistant to modernization that was, at the end of the day, aimed only at saving the empire?
Because modernization didn't just mean new uniforms and new guns. It meant a fundamental redistribution of power and wealth. And the core of that resistance was the Janissary Corps.
The elite infantry.
The elite infantry, originally raised through the Devshirme system, the levy of Christian boys. But by this point, they had evolved into this entrenched political, economic, and military power bloc.
So they were simultaneously the empire's best soldiers and its biggest political lobby against the Sultan.
That's a perfect way to put it. Their power had grown immensely, especially after recruitment rules relaxed in the early 1600s. They basically became a hereditary guild.
A guild with an army.
A guild with an army that controlled huge financial rackets. Their pay was often corruptly inflated, and they were intensely hostile to any new disciplined force that might threaten their status, their income, or their sheer political power.
It's a terrible self-perpetuating system. They had the ability to resist and every motive to resist any kind of change.
And they acted on it. Their opposition, combined with conservative religious elements, the ulema, who saw Western-style reforms as a betrayal of Islamic law. All of that culminated in the violent revolt of 1807.
And Selim III was deposed and later murdered.
Murdered. The image of the reformer being killed by the very tradition he tried to save is just harrowing.
So if we look back at this first failed attempt, what's the chilling takeaway for the next generation of reformers?
The takeaway was absolute. The internal reactionary power of the old guard, the Janissaries, was not just strong, it was powerful enough to completely nullify and ultimately destroy the Sultan himself.
So piecemeal change was impossible.
It was impossible. Any attempt at successful structural modernization would first require a decisive, brutal act of violence against the empire's own most powerful traditions. The old system had to be fully decapitated before the new one could even begin to breathe.
Which leads us directly to Mahmud II, who comes to the throne knowing exactly what happened to Selim III. He understood that the only way to save the Sultanate was to destroy the institutions that defined the old one.
Yes.
And that brings us to the infamous and decisive action of 1826, the auspicious incident.
Mahmud II learned the brutal lesson. You do not challenge the Janissaries on their own terms. He spent years quietly building support, gathering religious sanction, making sure he had a loyal artillery corps before he made his move.
So when the Janissaries were provoked into revolt in 1826, he didn't negotiate.
Not at all. He declared the entire corps enemies of the Prophet and the state.
And he didn't just disband them. He made an example of them by shelling their barracks right there in Istanbul. This was annihilation, politically and physically.
It was meant to be terrifying and absolute. The sources confirm the immense brutality. The corps was abolished, and the survivors were executed or exiled.
It was pragmatic, though. It cleared the single biggest obstacle to reform.
It was. But it was also a massive political gamble. He immediately replaced them with a modern European-style army. This was the true clearing of the foundation, finally allowing structural reform to begin without the crushing weight of that one particular tradition.
So with the greatest internal threat gone, you'd think he could focus on stabilizing the center. But instead, this era sees the rapid acceleration of the empire tearing itself apart through rising nationalism. The Eastern question becomes impossible to ignore.
Well, the empire was now weak enough that its subjects felt empowered to strike for independence, and the great powers were more than ready to intervene.
It started with the Serbs, right?
It started subtly with the Serbian Revolution, leading to a kind of de jure autonomy by 1830. But the truly successful dramatic break, the one that captured the European imagination, was the Greek War of Independence, starting in 1821.
This was a pivotal moment.
Absolutely. The Greek struggle wasn't just fueled by local desire for independence. It was fueled by the powerful tide of romanticism sweeping Western Europe. You had figures like Lord Byron going to fight for Greece, framing it as a reawakening of classical civilization against, Eastern despotism.
And that romantic narrative translated directly into political support.
And then military support when Russia, Britain, and France decided to intervene directly.
So the Ottomans and their Egyptian vassal forces were soundly defeated, culminating in the complete loss of the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Navarino in 1827.
Losing the fleet was disastrous. It forced the Sultan to concede, leading to the formal recognition of Greek sovereignty by 1832. This was devastating. The first part of the empire to achieve independence in this era. It was a template for future secessions.
If losing Greece was the first massive crack in the cathedral's foundation, the next crisis brought the entire structure to the brink of total collapse, and it came from within.
The Egyptian crisis.
I'm still astonished that a nominally loyal viceroy could almost overthrow the Sultan.
This is perhaps the moment of lowest Ottoman decline. Muhammad Ali Pasha, the governor of Egypt, was no ordinary provincial ruler. He was a modernizer in his own right, maybe even more effective than the Sultan.
With a powerful French-trained army and navy.
A very powerful one. He had lost his fleet helping the Sultan during the Greek War, and he demanded control of Syria and Crete as compensation.
Mahmud II refused, and Muhammad Ali essentially unleashed the best-trained fighting force in the entire region against his own sovereign.
A better, more disciplined, and better-led army than the Sultan's new troops. Muhammad Ali's son, Ibrahim Pasha, led the revolt in 1831. This modern force just marched rapidly through the Levant, defeating every Ottoman army sent against it.
And they reached Kütahya in Anatolia. That's what, only 200 miles from Istanbul?
About 200 miles from the gates of Istanbul. It's an absolute existential threat. They were just days, maybe hours away from the capital.
This puts Mahmud II, the man who just purged the traditionalists, in an impossible position. What choice did he have?
This decision is the critical turning point that really codified Ottoman weakness for the rest of the century. He had to choose. Either be overthrown by his own rebellious viceroy and his French-trained army, or appeal to an external power for survival.
So in utter desperation, he appeals to the empire's traditional arch-rival, Russia.
He effectively begged the wolf to protect the flock from a rogue shepherd.
Unbelievable.
And Tsar Nicholas Alous, seeing an immense geopolitical opportunity, sent an expeditionary force. The Russian presence successfully deterred Ibrahim Pasha from advancing. But the price was the Treaty of Hunkar-Iskelesi, which basically turned the Ottoman Empire into a Russian protectorate for a time.
So the consequence, as you mentioned, becomes the central tragic pattern of Ottoman decline. The government now needed the military protection of foreign, often hostile powers just to survive internal threats.
It meant the state could no longer stand on its own feet, even after the brutal efficiency of the auspicious incident. The state was structurally and militarily dependent. And that deep, immediate humiliation of relying on Russia was arguably the primary force behind the need for even deeper, more radical reform.
The Tanzimat.
The Tanzimat. They realized military fixes weren't enough. They needed legal and political legitimacy to survive.
The humiliation of the Egyptian crisis and that dependence on Russia led directly to the Tanzimat, the reorganization, starting in 1839. This wasn't just about new muskets. This was a whole new concept of the state. This is where the architects really started putting the steel and glass into the ancient cathedral.
The Tanzimat was a direct response to the Egyptian threat and, the rising tide of nationalism. It had two goals: centralize power and win over the loyalty of non-Muslim and peripheral subjects. It began in 1839 with the Edict of Gulhain.
And what was the revolutionary core of this edict?
It articulated the concept of Ottomanism, that everyone, regardless of ethnic background or religious affiliation, was an equal citizen of the empire.
It promised legal equality, security of life, property for all subjects.
For all subjects. This initiated a profound legal revolution, guaranteeing fair and public trials for everyone, and most critically, validating non-Muslim testimony in court proceedings.
Okay, hold on. I want to challenge that. Validating non-Muslim testimony is a complete break from centuries of Islamic tradition, which privileged Muslim legal standing over that of the dhimmi. This must have caused enormous friction.
It was a fundamental rupture, and the friction was immense. Under the traditional system, non-Muslims faced severe institutional restrictions. They couldn't carry weapons, they had to pay a special tax, and they certainly couldn't testify against a Muslim in court.
So the Tanzimat Edict and later reforms directly challenged that ancient hierarchy.
Directly, it was a clear move towards secular Napoleonic-style legal codes.
So the state is modernizing its legal framework, centralizing power. But this kind of radical change requires a radical administration. You mentioned the bureaucracy swelled substantially. How big of a jump are we talking about?
The sources suggest it grew 4 to 5 times its original size over this period, and the growth was necessary. You needed officials trained in Western law, translators, engineers, officials, to manage the new tax collection systems.
And this bureaucratization was the key to modernization.
It was. It allowed Istanbul to exercise direct authority over areas that had previously been run by local potentates.
But if the bureaucracy expanded that quickly, didn't that just lead to a massive implementation gap between the lofty goals in Istanbul and the reality in the provinces? I mean, didn't it just create new kinds of corruption?
That is precisely the paradox. The growth created immense new inefficiencies. The new bureaucrats were often Western educated, they lacked local experience, and the populace often saw them as totally disconnected from local realities.
So implementation was slow and inconsistent.
Very. And it was often met with local resistance, particularly from conservative religious leaders and local magnates who were losing power. The goals were noble, but the execution was often deeply flawed, leaving many minority groups feeling that the promised equality never actually arrived.
And meanwhile, the state was racing to adopt the core infrastructure needed for centralization, the telegraphs and railways.
Crucial adoptions. Telegraph networks began in 1847, the first railways in 1856. The telegraph, especially, was transformative. It allowed the central government to communicate instantly with remote provincial capitals.
It was the nervous system of the new centralized state machine.
Exactly.
These internal shifts were then tested by the next major geopolitical conflict, the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856. Now, while it secured the Ottomans' immediate safety from Russia, what was the crippling financial cost of this technologically advanced war?
The Crimean War was pivotal. The Ottomans, allied with Britain and France, won. But its technological nature, the first to use steamships, explosive shells, and, as we said, the telegraph for instant command, made it incredibly expensive.
And the cost of mobilizing a modern force led to a critical financial turning point,
Which was the birth of crippling foreign debt.
the first major foreign loan.
Absolutely. Until then, the state had relied mostly on internal loans. To finance the Crimean War, they took out their first substantial foreign loan in 1854, and that opened the floodgates. By the 1870s, the borrowing was out of control, often at very high interest rates to Western banks.
So returning to our analogy, the owners of the cathedral survived the immediate storm because the neighbors helped them fight, but they immediately had to mortgage the whole property to pay for the damage.
And that mortgage came with a dangerous rider, the extension of the capitulations. These were centuries-old legal exemptions for foreign residents. As European investment grew, so did the power of European creditors who were protected by these exemptions,
So foreign powers gained commercial and legal leverage inside Ottoman territory.
making the empire financially dependent and legally semi-sovereign in its own land. This debt structure set the stage for the total collapse 2 decades later.
By the mid-1870s, the paradox of the Tanzimat was clear. You have modernized institutions, but staggering debt and continued autocratic rule. The tension between the reformers and the Sultanate finally peaked in 1876.
This was the moment the reformers tried to structurally dismantle that heavy ancient spire entirely. Reformist statesmen, like Midhat Pasha, recognized that without constitutional limits on the Sultan's power, the state would just keep going through these cycles of crisis.
So they forced a coup.
They forced a coup in 1876, deposing the reigning Sultan and eventually introducing the empire's very first constitution, the Kanuna Esasi.
This was the high point of liberal, Western-style institutional grafting, an attempt to transition to a constitutional monarchy.
It was the ultimate statement that the Ottoman Empire could become a European-style parliamentary state. It was a desperate attempt to show the great powers that the empire was capable of self-reform and shouldn't be partitioned.
But the political experiment barely lasted a year before it was completely overshadowed by catastrophic military failure.
The Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878.
And this war was devastating.
It was. Russia used the pretext of massacres following a Bulgarian uprising to intervene, framing themselves as the protectors of Orthodox Christians. But despite the immense odds, the Ottomans showed flashes of brilliance.
The sources mention the legendary defense of Plevna, organized by Osman Pasha. Tell us what made that defense so fierce, but ultimately a failure.
Plevna became a symbol of Ottoman tenacity. Osman Pasha's troops successfully repelled two massive Russian assaults, inflicting colossal casualties on them. It was a real testament to the Sultan's new, modern army.
But he adhered strictly to orders to remain fortified.
Exactly. He refused to maneuver or break out, and that tactical adherence was crucial.
Why?
It allowed the Russians and their Romanian allies time to completely encircle Plevna. When the city finally fell, the path to Istanbul was wide open. The Russian army advanced rapidly, stopping only at San Stefano.
Just 12 kilometers from the capital.
A mere 12 kilometers.
So 40 years after relying on Russia to stop Muhammad Ali, they now had to rely on Britain to stop Russia from occupying Istanbul itself.
The cycle of dependency was completely entrenched. The British Mediterranean fleet sailed into the Dardanelles, which intimidated Russia and forced an armistice. And the conclusion of all this was the Congress of Berlin in 1878.
Where Europe basically sat down and formally ratified the carving up of Ottoman European provinces.
It was a brutal partitioning. Romania, Serbia, Montenegro all achieved complete independence. Bulgaria was established as a large, independent principality. And perhaps most symbolically galling, Austria-Hungary was unilaterally granted the right to occupy and administer Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Leaving the Ottoman state humiliated and functionally bankrupt. It lost, what, 40% of its European territory?
At least. But beyond the sheer territorial losses, the sources emphasize the profound demographic shift this war caused.
This is a crucial, often overlooked element.
It is. The war generated an enormous Muslim refugee crisis. Official records show over 500,000 Muslim refugees, 571,152 people, fled the ceded territories between 1876 and 1879, migrating toward the remaining Ottoman core in Anatolia.
That is a staggering human cost. And it must have fundamentally changed the political DNA of the remaining empire.
It did. It shifted the demographic balance decisively in favor of the Muslim population, which grew to 76% by the 1890s. And this massive influx of refugees, embittered by their treatment by Christian nationalist groups, profoundly influenced the policies of the next sultan.
Who would look to religious identity, not Ottomanism, as the new unifying glue?
Exactly.
The catastrophic defeat of 1877-1878 effectively validated the traditionalist argument. Constitutionalism brought disaster. The Sultan, Abdulhamid II, reacted by slamming the door shut on the reformers.
Immediately following the war, Abdulhamid II suspended the constitution and dissolved parliament. He reverted to a centralized, royalist dictatorship, governing personally from the seclusion of Yildiz Palace.
They called him the secluded Sultan.
Yes, ruling through this vast network of spies and censors.
With the old legal framework gone and the multicultural experiment of Tanzimat seeming to accelerate fragmentation, what was his strategy for holding on to the empire's remaining core?
His strategy was twofold. First, centralization and absolute control. Second, he leveraged the new demographics by emphasizing pan-Islamism and his role as the caliph, the spiritual leader of all Muslims.
It was a conscious effort to secure the loyalty of his new Muslim majority.
And to project influence outside the empire, positioning himself as a leader in a world increasingly dominated by European colonial powers.
But here is the profound irony of the Hamidian period. The autocrat still presided over significant modernization. He modernized the state machine while repressing the political thought that drove that modernization.
This is the critical contradiction. Despite the political repression and the paranoia, the state became more powerful, organized, and effective internally than ever before. He expanded the education system significantly, including girls' schools.
Because he believed a modern, trained populace was necessary for the empire to compete.
Yes, he modernized the machine, but insisted on keeping his hand firmly on the controls, centralizing power via the telegraph network.
And he invested heavily in infrastructure like the Hejaz Railway,
which was both a critical military logistical line connecting the capital of the Arab provinces and a huge symbol of pan-Islamism, built to facilitate the pilgrimage to Mecca.
So he was cultivating the very class that would eventually overthrow him. By expanding higher education and training a modern officer corps, he was creating a generation steeped in the very ideas he was actively trying to repress.
That is the ultimate fatal flaw of the Hamidian system. He needed modern military officers and bureaucrats to run his modern state, but those individuals were trained in schools where ideas like constitutionalism, liberty, and self-determination were currency. You can't stop ideas, even if you ban the books.
This era also saw the intensification of the Armenian question, culminating in immense violence. How did the Hamidian regime manage nationalist tensions in eastern Anatolia in the 1890s?
The tension was fueled by the previous Russian war and the failure of European powers to enforce promised reforms for the Armenian population. Abdulhamid II responded with a complex and often devastating military policy.
The Hamidi regiments.
The Hamidi regiments. They were primarily irregular cavalry drawn from loyal Kurdish tribal units in eastern Anatolia.
What was the strategy there?
It was strategic. It integrated peripheral, traditionally hostile groups like the Kurds into the Ottoman military structure, while also creating a decentralized force to counter Armenian nationalist militias. The downside, however, was immense, as it created a structure for localized violence.
And the crackdown was swift and brutal.
It was devastating. The deployment of the Hamidi against Armenian communities, coupled with local resentment, led to mass killings, starting notably in Sasson in 1894 and spreading across numerous cities in 1895 and 1896.
In response, Armenian nationalists tried to force European intervention with acts of violence, like seizing the Ottoman Bank. Did that high-stakes gamble pay off?
Crucially, no. The Armenians pinned their hopes on the great powers, especially Britain, but the balance of power worked against them. Tsar Nicholas II opposed any British intervention, viewing the region as Russia's sphere of influence.
He feared that an Armenian state led by revolutionaries would infect his own Armenian subjects.
Exactly, with radical ideas like socialism and nationalism. So the great powers prioritized maintaining their spheres of influence over the humanitarian crisis.
Which sets the stage for the Young Turks. The Western-educated elite, tired of despotism, defeat, and corruption, decided the only way to save the modern state was to restore the constitution.
The Young Turks, or the Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP, were largely composed of these secret societies of officers and students born from the Sultan's own modern schools.
Especially the military academies.
Especially them. Their single, unified goal was to restore the 1876 Constitution and parliamentary government.
Their revolution in 1908 was remarkably swift.
It was launched dramatically in July 1908, with key figures like Niyazi Bey and Enver Bey leading mutinies from Ottoman Macedonia. The Sultan's centralized power, which depended on the loyalty of his modern army, just collapsed instantly when those officers refused to march against the rebels.
So Abdulhamid II quickly conceded.
He had no choice. He proclaimed a return to parliamentary government.
And the initial reaction sounds like a moment of true idealistic fulfillment of the Tanzimat's original promise.
It was a transport of joy and ideological clarity. The proclamation of free and equal suffrage for all races was met with incredible, spontaneous enthusiasm. The sources describe scenes where Muslim Hojas and Orthodox clergy embraced in the streets, shouting for the Padishah and the Constitution.
A powerful, if ultimately brief, moment where Ottomanism seemed triumphantly possible.
It really did.
But even that brief window of liberal hope was immediately exploited by external powers, proving the empire was still the sick man.
Instantly. Profiting from the political upheaval in Istanbul, Austria-Hungary officially annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908. The revolution might have been a success for the constitutionalists, but it was just another geopolitical opportunity for the neighbors to claim another piece of the mortgaged property.
We've navigated a century of radical reform, violent reaction, near extinction, and geopolitical humiliation. We've seen the crushing of tradition and the birth of modernity. What's the final composite legacy of this 1789 to 1908 struggle? Where did the reformers succeed, and where did it all fundamentally fail?
We have to recognize the magnitude of the success first. The Ottoman state, by 1908, was fundamentally transformed. It went from a loose, traditional theocracy into a centralized, modern bureaucratic state.
The military was professionalized, the legal codes were updated, the state had infrastructure like telegraphs and railways.
Yes, the machinery of the state was completely overhauled and made functional for the 20th century. The infrastructure was built.
But the failure was in the realm of identity and politics.
And it was paradoxical. The reforms, which promised universal equality in Ottomanism to bind all ethnic and religious groups together, actually accelerated the empire's fragmentation.
How did that promise of equality actively hasten separatism?
Because the reforms advertised state weakness. They exposed the gap between the promise of equality and the reality of discrimination. So minority groups, the Greeks, the Bulgarians, now the Armenians, saw the new political discourse not as an opportunity to integrate, but as an opportunity to secure or enlarge their autonomy.
Often with the backing of external powers.
Always with the backing of external powers. The empire successfully modernized its structure, but failed catastrophically to modernize its identity in a way that satisfied its diverse populace.
So let's revisit our core analogy one last time, the ancient cathedral. How does this whole century of struggle sum up in architectural terms?
The struggle was a doomed, century-long attempt to graft Western democracy and modern institutions, the steel and glass, onto a fundamentally Eastern, theocratic imperial foundation.
The building survived. It got modern lighting and elevators.
It did. But the weight of the absolute Sultan and Caliphate, that heavy ancient spire, remained too great, and it kept cracking the new foundations built on universal legal equality and constitutionalism.
And what was the ultimate price of this impossible renovation?
The renovation was prohibitively expensive, leading to the ultimate mortgage. The empire mortgaged the property to European banks, which led to the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in 1881.
Which effectively ceded control of vital state revenues to European creditors.
Exactly. And those creditors then claimed individual rooms for themselves through territorial losses and the capitulations. By 1908, they had a modernized infrastructure, but a fragmented national identity, and the keys to the treasury were held in London and Paris.
That is a profound synthesis of a chaotic and contradictory period. But before we finish, the sources offer us one last remarkable lens to view this collapse of traditional male political authority through. We focused on the sultans, the pashas, the officers, but where else did continuous power lie?
This brings us into the intriguing dynamics of the harem. When the political authority of the Sultan and his viziers was collapsing, when Selim III was murdered, when Muhammad II was almost overthrown, the real silent continuity often lay in the dynastic structure itself.
And the traditional system was designed to ensure the state trumped the nuclear family.
It was, yet specific women of the palace often exerted profound, enduring power, especially during crises.
We are talking about the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan.
Precisely. Her authority became fundamentally political, especially after the shift in succession rules. When sultans were often figureheads or unstable, the relationship between mother and son became the fundamental, unshakable dynastic bond. The Valide Sultan became the supreme dynastic matriarch.
And this power was tangible, not just symbolic.
Incredibly tangible. She stood at the head of the harem, managing vast wealth from crown domains, and she often oversaw monumental public works, a visible demonstration of dynastic power. When political authority at the top was volatile, the Valide Sultan ensured the dynastic lineage, resources, and often the diplomatic management of court factions continued.
This raises a final, provocative thought for you to consider, the learner who's been with us through this deep dive. In an era marked by collapsing male authority, where sultans were murdered, janissaries rebelled, and the empire was continually defeated, was the most consistent, powerful, and enduring authority within the Ottoman structure actually held by the most secluded figures, the women of the harem, who managed the survival of the dynastic lineage, making the mother-son bond the fundamental political link when all other traditions failed.
An intriguing question that reminds us that power is rarely where the official histories claim it is. Something to mull over until our next deep dive. Thank you for joining us.